All right. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see everyone. We're going to get started here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bradley Peterson. I'm with the firm of Flaherty and Hood here in St. Paul and act as sort of the executive director and ringleader for our little group here. To kick things off, I would like to turn it over to our president for the year, Mayor Greg Zilka from Little Falls, to say a couple of words.
Good morning, everyone. As you can see, I have a clock in my background to keep Bradley on time. It works with John Rademacher, so it should work with Bradley. I'd like to welcome everyone to our Legislative Action Day. Special welcome to the new CGMC members and newly elected officials. Thank you for joining us. Today will be a day filled with conversation, a lot of information, and collaboration. So I hope you enjoy our day. It's very important to all of our small communities to have this day. So Bradley, take it away.
Very good. Thank you, Mayor Zilka. Again, welcome to our CGMC Legislative Day. Hang on a second. Just a little bit of a brief reminder. We have many new people, both new cities who have joined us recently, and then also new elected officials and new city staff. Just a reminder of kind of who CGMC is at our base, at our core. We are 109 cities working together, all outside of the 7-county metro area, really focusing on issues related to local government aid and property taxes, economic development, annexation and land use, transportation, environment and energy. And then we also do some work and collaboration amongst each other in the labor and employment area. So this is our event last year. Under normal circumstances, obviously we would be all together getting briefed on the issues. We'd be hearing from our elected leaders and then sending you off to lobby at the Capitol and then enjoying some fellowship at Mancini's later in the evening. This was March 11th last year, kind of what we refer to in the office as the last normal day. We were talking about social distancing, but not doing a great job of it at that point, as you can see. And by the time we left Mancini's, Tom Hanks had COVID and the NBA had canceled their season. So a lot changed very, very quickly, but I think we've done a pretty good job of adapting. And my hope is that we will, next time we gather, be able to do so in person rather than these virtual meetings. So a little bit of a sort of guide for the day. For the next hour or so, we're going to talk about the legislative landscape, talk about the issues that CGMC is going to be working on over the next several months, and a little bit about just kind of lobbying in the time of COVID, challenging as it makes everything. Then we'll be taking our break, and then we'll be back at 10:30 where we will have our legislative panel. We'll talk to them for about an hour about how things are going to go this session, if they can get along, can we get a budget, all of that good stuff. In the afternoon, hopefully many of you have made appointments with your legislators to contact them via Zoom. If not, we'd encourage you to take the information that you're going to learn today and meet with them at some point here in the next couple of weeks to discuss CGMC issues and your perspective on them. And then at 4 o'clock, we're going to try something in terms of gathering folks together for sort of a virtual happy hour and some trivia that staff here have put together. That should be fun to end the day with a little bit of lightness. So please, if you can, do try to join us for that. I think it'll be fun and it'll be an opportunity to interact with your colleagues from across the state. So starting with the legislative landscape. And, there's obviously a lot going on. There's a pandemic, there's economic woes, we've got civil strife. We had a very, very contested election here in November and December and January. And so tensions at the legislature and amongst legislative leaders are running high. At the very beginning of the year, actually, the Forum News Service gets together legislative leaders and the governor for some questions and some dialogue. And we're going to show you, hopefully, all all things hopeful here, video of just some of Governor Walz's comments, and more so than even the substance. I think just key into the tone of his voice, the level of frustration that he had with the conversation as it focused not necessarily on the issues that the state is facing, but on all of the federal partisan dynamics. So take a listen here at just some of Governor Walz's comments.
But here in Minnesota, if we can't agree on some basic facts, if we can't agree to come back together and figure out how to piece that, I don't know. I thought this was going to be a healing moment. It's why I look forward to coming on here. I have continued to try and find where that common ground is, but I'm candidly with you. How do we talk about reaching a compromise on a budget when we can't agree that our elections are fair? Apparently they were fair in each of the members who are on here's district. Apparently they were fair in other areas, but they mysteriously are not fair here. And we're not talking about other states. We're talking about people questioning the elections in the state of Minnesota and undermining this. I don't know how hard it is to unequivocally say this election is over and here's where we go. Any type of assault on our democracy. So I will let the rest of the questions go.
Governor, we have at least 2 direct questions for you before you might need to leave.
Sure. Those are things that I think has to have a conversation about, but no one's going to say that. I got members standing in front of my house, members of the legislature, standing in front of my house next to people carrying ARs because they don't like to wear a mask. So I just leave it to the reporters on here to figure out where that common ground is. But here in
So, as you can see, the governor was fired up about midway through there. There was a little bit of editing. It was not long after his comments, though, that the governor actually left the Zoom with legislative leaders. And so clearly things are tense. And that's kind of sets some of the stage here. The other piece of stage setting is the fact that as most of our lives have become, everything at the legislature, at least for now, is being done in a fairly virtual manner. And so our belief is that based on what they've said, that the House will likely be virtual for the entire session. That's, meetings with legislators, that's committee meetings. They are doing floor sessions with some limited members and staff, but very, very virtual from the House perspective. In the Senate, they want to move more towards what they're calling a hybrid model, where they're able to do some committee meetings in person, have testifiers in person, but with a remote option. And one of the things that we're also seeing in the Senate is that many of the members, especially on the Republican side, are more open and willing and even encouraging in-person meetings at their offices. And so we'll talk about that dynamic a little bit too. But very, very difficult circumstance to try to get anything done at the legislature. Everything takes longer. They have smaller committees, which is in some ways good because it's fewer people that you have to touch base with on any given issue. But so far anyways, it really feels like they are having many, many more meetings. They're doing the introduction to issues and walking through the jurisdictions of the committees, but the committee agendas, especially in the House, have been absolutely packed. So they are really, really trying to do quite a bit. Legislative leaders, for the most part, have been encouraging a narrower focus, really on the top issues, doing the budget, responding to COVID, that sort of thing. But that has not stopped them from holding hearings on issues that are sort of red meat, that are important for their respective base of voters. And so there's a little bit of a mixed message here in terms of how much are we actually focused on the bread and butter of the state budget versus how much are we focused on some of those things that are more controversial with the other side and that are not going to ultimately become law this session. And one of the things that we are seeing is because everyone is working remotely, including the Capitol staff, there is a backlog when it comes to getting pieces of legislation introduced. Normally, the revisor's office is cranking out bills very quickly, getting them to folks. They're getting taken around to get signed by co-authors and the such. Our understanding here as of the beginning of last week, they had a backlog of 1,700 bills that they were working on getting out the door. That is quite a few. And so, in our CGMC perspective, we're still working on getting bills introduced, getting bill numbers, getting authors nailed down. And so that's why this session, you'll hear less of us talking about very specific pieces of legislation and more what we're working on doing. You'll see those pieces of legislation, bill numbers, bill authors here in the coming weeks. So one thing I would say about this too is if your city is working on anything from an individual perspective, if you've got a bonding bill that you're working on or a local option sales tax or whatever it is, definitely be working with your legislator as quickly as you can to get those things in, because there is a backlog that is going to become problematic here. Key dates this session. So obviously it's all focused around the state budget. Yesterday, Governor Walz came out with his budget release, and we'll talk more about that here in a couple of minutes. At the end of February, very beginning of March, we get the budget forecast that will guide the budget setting process for the rest of the session. March 26th, everybody goes on spring break. This is their historically done Easter Passover break where they're gone for about a week. April, that's when you will begin to see the House and the Senate finalize their budget bills. Mid-April into May, that's when conference committees will theoretically take place, when negotiations between the House and the Senate and the governor really kick off. And then the last day of session for you Norwegian nationalists out there is set on May 17th, Syttende Mai. And so hopefully they will be able to finish by then. That's the constitutional deadline for when they need to finish. Obviously, the real deadline for the budget is July 1st when the next biennium starts. One thing that I should note that, after I'm done speaking here a little bit, we'll hopefully have some time for questions. So if you do have any questions, put them into the chat, and Julie or Kelly here will make me aware of them, and we'll take them then as we can. So what are the priorities for the various House majorities? On the DFL side, they're really focused on economic security, the social supports that folks need during COVID, housing, et cetera, worker protections, again, also sort of focused on COVID, testing and vaccine distribution, education, and what are the needs going to be there for our students. Childcare continues to be a focus of theirs in terms of supporting our childcare system and lowering the cost of childcare, something that they refer to as the Promise Act. This is a bill that will help pay for rebuilding certain neighborhoods in Minneapolis and St. Paul that were hit by the civil strife here in the spring and early summer. But it's also bigger than that. It focuses on some metropolitan-wide, 7-county metro-wide redevelopment efforts. Energy and climate is going to be a big topic with the DFL this year. They've already been moving legislation in the House on this issue. And then everything will be looked at from the House DFL perspective through an equity lens in terms of, how do these decisions and how do these bills and how do these proposals fit into an equity perspective and supporting folks across the age, color, demographic spectrum. On the Senate side, their priorities balance the budget without tax increases. And one of the things that they're going to be talking about is a 5% across the board cut to state agencies. They're very focused on reopening businesses and schools that have been obviously shuttered by the pandemic, protecting seniors especially in senior living situations. Very focused on pushing back against the MPCA's California Clean Car standards. They want to have a discussion about reforming the governor's emergency powers, and then also some focus on housing and home ownership. And so those are the competing values and perspectives of the House and Senate as we open session here. So what are the big questions? The big questions for the session. First off, as we saw at the very beginning, the tension between the governor and legislative leaders, can they just get along? Can they get along to get the business that we need done? How transparent and accessible will the process be? I think one of the concerns, even when they're all there in person and the public is there in person, is that over time, the process has become less and less transparent. That decision-making has been concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, and the virtual nature of the legislature is frankly compounding that. The legislature is doing a lot of its work either via Zoom calls or, in a Capitol, behind a door, behind a locked door, behind a fence. And that's I think is troubling. So that's something that we'll be paying attention to. Will there be a bonding bill? We had a bonding bill here in October, but I think there is some discussion, and we're certainly going to be talking more about the idea that there does need to be a small bonding bill, at least to invest in infrastructure here going forward. How much of a role will the legislature reclaim as it relates to the COVID response and emergency powers? This, of course, is one of the priorities of the Senate, as we discussed. How will the budget ultimately be resolved? What will be the mix of revenue increases and shifts and use of the budget reserve, et cetera? And then, of course, can they finish on time? So the backdrop for all of this, obviously, is the state budget and what's going on there. So we're going to spend a little bit of time just kind of talking about where things are and how they look. Some of this will look somewhat familiar to many of you, but I think it bears repeating, as it does set the context for our discussion here. So in May, they took the unprecedented step of doing sort of an interim budget projection in light of the pandemic. And what we saw at that time was that for the current budget cycle that we're in, that ends here at the end of June, we had a $2.4 billion projected deficit. And looking into the next biennium that they're going to be working on the budget for, $4.7 billion deficit. Once we got to the November forecast, things looked a little bit better. We had more experience with the numbers. We had more solid certainty about a few things. For the current biennium, we actually showed a $600 million surplus, some of which they have already spent in December on some COVID relief measures, but we still are carrying a surplus. And then for the next biennium, the deficit shrunk, the projection shrunk to $1.3 billion. So better news, but I think still a lot of uncertainty in terms of, December, November, December, January, we've had, a retraction in terms of things being open, things being more shut down. We don't know what the timing of a vaccine will be. We don't know if the federal government will be able to push out another stimulus package. So a lot of uncertainty here as we go forward. But we will know here a little bit more what we're dealing with, as I said, once we get to the beginning of March and the next budget forecast. One of the tools that will certainly come into play is the state budget reserve. Many of you remember the bad old days of the late aughts and the early teens here, where the bank was essentially empty. We were scraping the couch cushions for any loose change we could find. And then over time, starting in the middle of the Dayton administration, began to build back the budget reserve now to a fairly healthy level. And that blue line there is kind of the recommended level that the budget reserve should be at. And so from a budget reserve perspective, we've got some resources to work with. So yesterday, as I mentioned, Governor Walz came out with what he's calling his COVID-19 recovery budget. The gentleman in the picture there is Commissioner Showalter, the Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget, looking very serious, as these are serious times. And so the governor's budget, in kind of a nutshell, some of the highlights, it is $52.4 billion for the biennium, and it covers the $1.3 billion deficit, with $1 billion from the budget reserve and the rainy day fund, borrowing some money from the stadium reserve fund. Carries over the remaining dollars from the current budget year. And then $1.6 billion in new revenue, most significantly creating another income tax tier for those making over $1 million a year. Like I said, it increases spending by about $1.3 billion. The highlights of kind of some of the funding from our perspective, what they include: business grants, some workforce development dollars, childcare assistance, more money for schools and bringing our students back, broadband infrastructure. And really from our perspective, of the highlight is that, at least right now, the governor is not proposing any changes to local government aid. So no increases, but no cuts. And that is something that certainly we are prioritizing this year as we go forward. So what is our game plan sort of generally here? Each week in February, we are going to be launching what we are referring to as our advocacy theme weeks. Part of this came out of the discussion of how do we do this legislative day when we can't be together. And so we are looking at new and additional tools and opportunities for you to engage with the legislature. So starting next week, we'll be focused on local government aid, then childcare in the second week, water and wastewater infrastructure, and then finally ending February with a focus on housing. We'll be utilizing quite a bit of social media, and so you'll want to follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and follow our website, all listed there. We're working on drafting guest columns to put out in the print media for each week on each one of these issues. We are working on meetings with key legislators and members of the administration, and I know Julie sent out an email from the CGMC account here earlier this week, inviting folks to, if you're interested in participating in any of these meetings, to contact the appropriate staff member who's kind of in charge of that area. So we're looking for opportunities to engage all of you in this discussions as well. And then we're also going to have some opportunities, and my colleagues will talk more about those here in a couple of minutes, around some member education and engagement opportunities and some other ways for you to be involved. So every Monday, look for an email that lays out what the theme for that week is and what are the different activities that you'll get a chance to plug into. So one of the things that we wanted to just talk a little bit about is kind of the COVID response so far and what CGMC has been involved in. Most recently in December, the legislature at its 7th and final special session for the year did pass a relief bill with money going directly to businesses, as well as some money being sent to businesses through counties. We in our office were involved in many of these discussions about what is the best way to push these dollars out, how do you make sure you do so fairly, what are the best mechanisms for doing so, who's well positioned to help distribute this money. They've also created a fund for movie theaters and convention centers of about $5 million and extended unemployment benefits through early April. Childcare, again, something that we've been very involved in the discussion on. When the pandemic first hit, the initiative foundations and folks that we have partnered with actually quite a bit on the childcare discussion came forward and really stepped up very early to assist providers before any state funding became available. Over time, state funding and support became available, and that got pushed out to childcare providers, but that largely ended in December, and there was not any funding included in the most recent legislation. But there is some federal stimulus that got passed in December, and that is now providing more money for child care grants for January and February, and then some money left over to see what we need to do at that point. Again, these are issues that, as they've developed and as the state has been framing its response, we've actually been very, very involved in those discussions. The federal relief that passed, you can see the full scope of it. Again, I mentioned the child care, there's some broadband money, the PPP loan program. Most significantly from our perspective though, there was no money at that time for state or local governments. Unlike in March, when they passed the stimulus and pushed out the CARES Act money, there was not any money in the most recent December federal legislation. But we are hopeful that the discussion that's currently underway at the federal level with President Biden's proposed $1.9 trillion aid package will include some money. They have proposed $350 billion in aid for state and local governments. And so we are hopeful that that will come forward. Should that occur, and should there be another discussion about how do we distribute this money, obviously CGMC will be involved in that discussion to ensure that no matter where you are in the state, you are getting the resources that you need to operate and to tackle the pandemic. So protecting LGA. This is going to be the object of our first theme week here next week. And I think one of the things that we've been talking to legislators most about as we've been meeting with new legislators. Now, the budget forecast situation does look a little bit better, and Governor Walz did not do anything with LGA in his budget, but we are leaving nothing to chance. We are going to make sure that in 2021 and in 2022 and going forward, that LGA is protected, that it is paid on time and in full. And so this is a major thrust of our advocacy this year. A little bit of a reminder, refresher of kind of where we're at. Those of you who have been around for quite a while are noting probably that our graph now starts in 2009 and not 2002. Since we were able to get back to the 2002 level, we've decided that we don't need a 20 bar graph. And so in 2022 there, you see that we are anticipating $564 million getting pushed out in total through the local government aid program. That number will remain the same. It is hardwired into statute until the legislature changes it up or down. Literally scratches out the number that says 564 and writes a new one in its place. So defending LGA this session, as I said, we're looking at $564 million. Our main goal to make sure that it gets paid on time and in full. We've got our legislative advocacy week coming up. We've got a great guest column that is almost complete here that we'll be sending out. We'll be sending a draft resolution to every city, asking you to pass it and express your support for ongoing local government aid funding. Look for more information on meetings with legislators. Social media, again, look for more on Monday about what we're going to be doing there. And then we've also put together, and Julie sent around a whole packet of material, but we also put together some very helpful quotes and perspectives from our members based on the survey that we did in December of all members. And that's, I think, been really impactful because it's been helpful to have your voices and your perspectives and your words to put in front of legislators. Oh, we have a question. Let's take a question.
Ron Johnson asks, any talk of a formula change for LGA?
So Ron Johnson asked, is there any talk of any formula changes for LGA? So just yesterday, in fact, I had a meeting with Representative Marquardt, chair of the House Tax Committee, and Representative Iwakim, who is the chair of the House Property and Local Tax Division, which is sort of the subgroup of the tax committee that takes the first swing at issues like LGA and local option sales taxes. So I met with both of them yesterday, and I think that there is some interest in beginning a discussion about the formula and where it might need to go. But my understanding based on that conversation is that what Representative Iwakim wants to do is put together sort of a working group that involves a couple of legislators, some the city groups, us, the League, Metro Cities, et cetera, to begin talking about what some of these things would look like, with most of the work being done after the session and in the interim heading into the next legislative session. So there is interest. There is a loose framework right now that has been talked about in terms of doing some formula discussion, but I would doubt that anything significant would be in the offing still for this legislative session. So as we talk about LGA, how are we framing the discussion for the legislature? Well, first off, cities have been on the front lines this whole time in terms of COVID response, and they will be for the economic recovery. You all have stepped up, waiving fees, delaying property tax collections, easing regulations, providing space for socially distant outdoor activities like dining. These, I think, are things that you should remind policymakers of. You all have done an amazing job of being flexible and really trying to do everything you can to make your communities work in this very difficult time. Third, the services that are paid for by LGA will be the foundation for economic recovery, especially in greater Minnesota. If we're going to have a good economic recovery when we're all vaccinated, we're going to need public safety, quality infrastructure, and all the other public services that make our communities great places to live and work. And you already have been doing quite a bit to prepare your budgets for this year. You've constrained your budgets, deferred projects, deferred capital purchases, limited your levy increases, in some cases either holding them flat or even decreasing them in many cases. And you've reduced staff and new hires and all sorts of other activities. And I think that's another thing that is good that you may need to remind your legislators of. You know, one of the things that we sometimes hear as well, you know, everyone has had to tighten their belt. Private sector has had to live with less. Government can and should too. And while that might be true to some extent, you already are doing that. you already have taken those steps. And so I think you need to tell that story. And if we are going to have a robust recovery, we still have to have investments in public safety, infrastructure, quality of life amenities, those sorts of things on the back end of the pandemic. One other thing that I will mention, and I'm less concerned about it than I maybe was last fall, but every now and again, you'll hear a legislator say, well, you got all this money last year. You got all that CARES Act money. Why do you need more money? Well, the CARES Act money was limited both in time and in scope. That money is gone. You had to spend it all or give it back by the end of last year, and you could only spend it on very specific things. And those things are not a replacement for LGA. The things that you spent money on were to deal with the crisis at hand. LGA is what you're going to need to run your city and provide for the recovery going forward. So before I turn it over to my colleague, we'll take a question or two.
Yeah, we have a question, just if you could elaborate a bit on how you see things playing out for LGA this session, considering the governor's budget plan and maybe his idea for some tax increases and the Senate GOP looking for some cuts. Do we see a fight brewing?
So the question is, given how far apart the governor is and likely to be from the Senate Republicans in terms of the budget, is it possible that we could see a fight over LGA brewing? It is certainly possible. I think that, one of the things that especially those of you who are around in 2008, 2009 understand is that you can't take anything for granted, right? Those are the time of unallotments. And it was very difficult. But I think we've got a couple of things in our corner. One, I think we are getting out in front of that discussion and laying the case for why local government aid is important. Two, we've got a governor who historically has been very supportive of local government aid, provided for the last increase that we had. And three, we in Representative Marquardt have a powerful ally in the House tax chair. And as his comment to me and others has been that, folks have really taken it on the chin in terms of COVID and their businesses and their own pocketbooks, and property taxes are one thing that the state can very much influence. And so from his perspective, he is, and this was his word, quote, drawing the line on doing anything that would make property taxes need to go up. And from his perspective, first and foremost on that would be local government aid. And so, we've got a lot of folks who are committed to local government aid. We're continuing to make the case. We'll see what happens here in the next coming months with the next budget forecast and with the discussion once it really gets rolling, both in the House and the Senate, and where we end up in April and May. But that's why we're doing the work now. That's why we're not letting folks off the hook in terms of this discussion. That's why we're being vigilant. Another question.
Another question, just a more general question. Do you anticipate the Senate to shoot down legislation until the governor's powers are emergency powers are rescinded?
So a question about whether or not I would anticipate that the Senate would shoot down legislation until the governor relents from his emergency powers. I do not think so. The tone, at least on that particular discussion, seems to be more cooperative. Certainly, the Senate wants to have a conversation about the governor's powers and how the legislature can have more influence in the COVID response. But I would be surprised if it devolved to the point where absolutely nothing got done before that discussion happened. Time for one more question if we had it. Looks like we're good. Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Elizabeth, who is going to talk about some of the things that we're doing on the environment.
Thank you, Bradley. As Bradley mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Wafel, and I know many of you, but for those whom I don't, I'm an attorney here at Flaherty and Hood, and I handle the environment and energy lobbying for the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities, as well as the annexation and land use areas. But today I'm just going to be focusing on what are our top priorities at the legislature for the environmental area, and what do we expect to be working on aside from those priorities. And Oh, sorry. This is not my computer. First thing I want to talk about is bonding. As Bradley, referred to, this fall we had a very large bonding bill that helped a lot of our members, both on specific projects and grant programs. And pushing for the passage of that bill was a top priority for CGMC throughout 2020. We did press conferences, media, a lot of things that really helped move that forward. And it was a great bonding bill, but we think we need to be doing another bonding bill this year. There's this myth out there that a bonding bill happens only every other year. But if you really look at the history of bonding at the Capitol, over the last several decades, there have been many sort of cycles where we've seen a bonding bill every year. Smaller ones during the odd years, but it's still an important bill to move forward. The bonding bill really is one of the best ways to stimulate the state economy. And as we're trying to recover from the pandemic, that's really important. Moreover, the infrastructure needs in our state are really great. We've also seen some, both in the House and Senate, have signaled some receptivity to a small bill. So we want to make this a priority. And as part of that, one of the top priorities for us is going to be pushing on PFA bonding. The PFA is the Public Facilities Authority. This is like the state's bank for wastewater, drinking water, and sewer projects. They offer both grants and loans to our communities to get these projects done. Our request will be $100 million to the PFA. We have the bill jackets ready. We're working with the authors and hope to have it introduced soon. It will put about $10 million towards EPA matching grants, which help make those loan programs work. And then the rest of the money would be equally divided between the Point Source Implementation Grant Program as well as the Water Infrastructure Funds, both which offer grants to our cities. Apologize. Now the question may arise, why are we seeking $100 million? People, and in fact, I'm getting this question from legislators. Didn't we just bond for more than $200 million in water funding? But, even with record funding in 2020, the PFA programs are underfunded, and we're going to see multiple projects, across the state that will be delayed without more funding. Take a look at Ely. They need to be, working on a facility to remove mercury from their water. If we don't put more money into the Point Source Implementation Grant Program, that project may get delayed. And there's multiple projects of our members across the state that will get delayed, which raises costs if we don't get that done. We believe that we need $100 million this year to help keep up with that projected need. And this isn't just a number that we pull out of our hats. I spent time with the PFA Executive Director, Jeff Freeman, in December working on this number. We looked at the Water Infrastructure Needs Survey, EPA Survey of Drinking Water, the project priority list, and our historical experience at the state to come up with this number. Now, looking at this, let's talk a little bit about those needs. It is projected, based on a survey done every 2 years by the MPCA, that we will need $4.12 billion, yes, that's $1 billion over the next 20 years to meet our wastewater needs. And that's just the things we know about. And what's important to emphasize about that is about 62% of that need is in Greater Minnesota. And it's a combination of aging infrastructure, the need to upgrade for different regulatory requirements, and some of the things, some of the problems we're seeing with other needs. With respect to water, sorry, that just went, how do we go backwards?
Right click and previous slide.
You're just using back arrow.
Your arrows aren't working.
Your arrows aren't right. I apologize. I'm working with somebody else's computer and I'm having problems with my slides. But the main point with drinking water is that $7 billion is projected over the next 20 years. And again, this is a variety of different things like the water pipes, treatment, and whatnot. So the fact is that we need to continue. How do I go next? I really apologize about this. Again, not my computer. and trying to make the case for $100 million. Again, you're going to get questions about why do we need this? Now, a couple things to be pointing out. If we don't get that money, projects are delayed, which drives up the cost. We saw this when the bonding money was delayed 2 years ago, and we've seen this multiple times that if you don't get the money out there, costs go up. 70% of greater Minnesota needs are related to aging infrastructure, and we need to get that replaced, to move forward on our growth in greater Minnesota. We can't spread costs over a large rate base like the metropolitan area can, and that's really a big thing to remember. And finally, some of the pushback we get from some quarters is, well, why don't you just change the regulatory environment? And that's something that we continue to work on, but the needs are still there, particularly with our aging infrastructure. It's really important that we continue to put money into the PFA every year to work on these projects. Okay, thank you. That's not the only thing we're going to be working on this year. Our other top priority is working on PFAS. Now, again, it gets a little confusing because we have PFA and PFAS. But what PFAS are per and polyfluoroalkyl alkyl substances, and they are found in many everyday products. Your Teflon, your Scotchgard, your Gore-Tex. The challenge with these chemicals is that they can contaminate the water. There's been a lot of news coverage, for example, over the last several years about water contamination in the East Metro area. You may have also heard about the problems Bemidji has had with PFAS in their drinking water. There's been a real increased awareness of the PFAS as a public health concern. It's showing up in water almost everywhere, and it's showing up in human blood. Both, the MPCA, environmental groups, and environmental regulators are really paying more attention to the regulation of PFAS. And it's something that we are trying to make strides on because of the impact to wastewater. One of the challenges our communities face, in addition to dealing with it in the drinking water, is that from a wastewater perspective, there is no effective treatment for PFAS in wastewater. There's just, once it gets into wastewater, there's no way to get it out. So the thing that needs to be done is controlling it at the source. And about 18 months ago, our wastewater operators from across the state started reaching out to us and saying, hey, we need to do something about this because otherwise folks are going to look at us to remove it. We need to be focusing on how do we keep it out of our wastewater stream. So we have been partnering with MESERB, which is a sister organization made up of wastewater operators, as well as the League of Minnesota Cities, to come up with a municipal PFAS strategy. We have legislation that will be authored by Senator Rude in the Senate and Representative Fisher in the House that would put $500,000 towards the municipal source reduction strategy. This strategy does three things. Basically, it would try to help cities identify what are the major sources of PFAS going into your wastewater. What are the strategies that you can use to try and address those sources? And finally, helping to educate our operators and our public about this problem. So this is something that's really important for our communities to sort of get at this problem, before it becomes bigger. So we want you to tell your legislators to help us fund this strategy. Now, this is something that's not the only thing with respect to PFAS we will be working on at the legislature. We are seeing at both the state and federal level, good and bad legislation about PFAS. We are evaluating proposals and trying to decide what to do next. There's some proposals that we are fine with. For example, the MPCA has a proposal to study what happens when you apply biosolids that have PFAS in them. That's the leftovers from your wastewater process. So what happens if there's PFAS there? Something we think that should be studied. But there's also problematic legislation. There's legislation that would hold cities liable for PFAS that they don't create. That's a big problem, and we are pushing back hard. We're also worried that they may be trying to create water quality standards on PFAS for our wastewater facilities when we have no way to treat it. So that is something I'll be spending a lot of time on this session, is working to get our strategy in place as well as trying to stop bad legislation. There's other issues you can see here that we will be working on for the environment. I'm constantly watching bills, reaching out to other city organizations as well. We are also continuing to work on, rulemaking processes and regulatory issues that affect our our wastewater operators. We will continue to be busy with the environmental area. These are a few things we're working on, but I would encourage you, if you have questions, even if you think of them later, my contact information here, it is here. You can reach out and ask me, but it looks like I'm getting flagged. We actually have questions.
Cities have responsibilities for maintaining their distribution systems. Seems cities that work on their systems get behind when others do not keep up and end up needing grants which then taxes everyone.
Cities should absolutely have some responsibility for keeping their distribution systems up. But I'll be honest, I spent time on the phone with 2 city administrators this week who are seeking PFA money for their water systems and for their sewers pipes and their drinking water pipes. And, these are 2 cities that are extremely responsible and, extremely fiscally responsible. They are doing all the right things, but it just gets really expensive. And in these 2 cities, with both of them, the projects they're working on are in older neighborhoods with lower income residents. And, one of the challenges there is that, a lot of times with those sewer projects, part of the project gets billed back to the community members. When you've got people who are low income, it's really hard to afford that. And I think that by and large, the cities in the coalition are progressive cities. They are being financially responsible, but it becomes too expensive to do so. So I think that our city, we really need to recognize that. And I think that they are being responsible, but sometimes it's just not enough. Yes.
Could class 3 and 4 waters rulemaking changes possibly free up money for other water improvements?
Well, I would say that making changes to the class, and for those of you who are not familiar with it, right now there are changes being made to something called the class 3 and 4 water rules. And those are often referred to as the SALT parameters rules. And right now we've got multiple cities across the state that if we don't change these rules, we'll end up with extremely problematic limits in their wastewater permits. And I would say that hopefully, those changes look like they're going forward. It's something I'm very actively engaged in. We hope they will get in place, but it doesn't necessarily free up money. What it would do is sort of not increase that needed spending. When you look back at that earlier number with the PFA and, that projected $4 billion that we're expecting to see over for wastewater, a lot of that doesn't, because it's based on sort of what a city is guessing it needs, a lot of that doesn't pick up sort of the regulatory changes that are going to be happening in the out years. So it frees it up in the sense that that need number is not going to go higher, but the needs are still going to be pretty big. It's kind of like battling down a whole bunch of flames, and this is a flame we're battling down to keep the needs from not getting bigger. Well, very excited for upcoming Water Infrastructure Advocacy Week. That will be focused on the request for PFA funding. So contact me if you want to get involved. It's from February 15th to the 19th. It's going to be great because everybody loves wastewater. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Scott McMahon. I'm a lobbyist with Flaherty and Hood. I work on behalf of the coalition on a number of issues. But in addition, I also serve as the executive director for the Greater Minnesota Partnership, which is the coalition's partner organization that brings together a broader spectrum of Greater Minnesota stakeholders, businesses, chambers of commerce, the initiative foundations, higher education and such, to work on issues of economic development that impact our communities. And so I want to spend a little bit of time this morning walking through what our priorities are for this session, to give you a sense as to some of the key data points that you may want to be thinking about as you're talking with the legislators, as well as highlight the bills that we're working on. As Bradley indicated, we are in this log jam with the revisor's office, so bills are coming out slowly. But the items that I'll be highlighting here, we will let you know bill numbers once they are announced. So looking at the issues that we're really caring about this session, and none of these issues are new for any of you. They've been top priorities for us for the past 2 years. They're childcare, housing, and infrastructure. On the childcare front, we really want to see the state support our childcare providers, especially those impacted by the pandemic. We have seen a significant reduction in families enrolling in childcare as the pandemic has taken hold. The reality is post-pandemic, we're still going to have that same level of demand we had a year ago. And so we need these providers to stay in the marketplace so that our workers have a place to put their kids so they can get back into their work settings when that time comes. We also want to see the state address this lingering 40,000 childcare slot deficit that we have in Greater Minnesota. On the housing side, we want to see investments made in programs that actually address the issues we face in Greater Minnesota. And I'll get into more detail about that here in a minute. And then finally, infrastructure. We know that the Business Development Public Infrastructure Program is one of the best things that we have in Greater Minnesota for stimulating job growth and economic development in our community. And we want to make sure that that program is fully funded for the upcoming biennium. So looking at childcare, some of the things to keep in mind on this issue, again, we have this almost 40,000 childcare slot deficit. And so as you think about that, as we have our families looking at how do we get our childcare in place so that we can go off and work, when we're short that many, that becomes the point in which families and workers are making decisions about what they're going to do based off of that being a key point for them. And to put this in perspective as to what our demand should be on this, 74% of Minnesota families with children under 6 have both parents working. So in that situation, those are the families, the kids aren't old enough for school, and so daycare or other sort of childcare is what they need in order to make those workforce decisions. Right now, and this is largely driven by the pandemic, 48% of providers in a recent survey indicated that they're currently losing money. This has been going on even over the past 9 months. We've had this grant program that Bradley indicated earlier. This is going to continue for the foreseeable future until the pandemic is over. And so these grants that we have, that we've had in the past and that we have going forward for the next 2 months are really important for just trying to keep our providers in the marketplace so that when we're at that point of families coming back, that they're there. One of the big issues we face in the childcare industry is just the low wages that our providers are earning. On average, the median wage right now is $12.28. If you think about that, any childcare provider who's making that money is going to be better off going and working at your local gas station. They're going to have better hours, better benefits, and better pay. And so we really have these challenges in supporting our childcare industry, making sure we have providers that we need and have them throughout all of Greater Minnesota. Another issue that we have in childcare is just the cost of the startup for new childcare. When you look at a new center, and these are on the low end of the numbers, but for a typical 52-seat childcare center, which is actually on the small side for a center, we're looking at $500,000 for the startup costs. When you think about the fact that 48% of our providers are losing money, accessing the capital that these providers need to start the childcare business is really difficult in the private sector. And so we need to try and think about what role can the public play in supporting our childcare moving forward. So what are we working on this year? First off, we want to see the provider grants continued. As Bradley indicated, we have the money from the federal government from the last COVID bill. We want to see those grants continue for as long as we can to keep the industry propped up. We also want to see the renewal of the grants that we had from the last biennium for our 6 initiative foundations, for them to keep doing the work to support our providers and to build community efforts to address our local childcare shortages from community to community. We also want to see the facilities grant program that was established in the 2020 bonding bill passed this fall that wasn't funded in that bill finally get the funding. And so we're asking for $10 million in bonds and $10 million in cash for that grant program so that we can address the capital issue that we have for childcare going forward. And then we want to see $10 million in the DEED childcare grant provider program. This funds a lot of innovative efforts across our communities, from expansion to training to forgivable loans and such, that have really helped impact our ability to stabilize the marketplace and to grow it in a number of communities. So moving on, the second issue.
Question about Chapman?
Yes.
It seems the trend is more daycare centers. What roles can we play to encourage more home daycares?
So right now, home daycare is the the bulk of childcare in Greater Minnesota. The challenge that we have right now is that as the current providers, kind of age out of the industry, we aren't seeing as many traditionally younger women interested in the family care setting. And so one of the things that we're looking at is how can we move towards incorporating what's known as the pod model more in Greater Minnesota. And the pod model is where we can bring 4 or 5 family licensed providers together into a common space so that they can get better economies of scale and they can have that support network built around them. And so I think one of the things that will help is that if we can get some licensure reform in that arena and get some of these things like the Child Care Facilities Grant Program established so that those providers can access more capital funding to make these things happen, we'll see some growth in that sector of the marketplace. So moving into housing. Yes, Ju.
That one ahead. On childcare, all of our focus seems to be on offsetting the high costs. Is there an opportunity to also advocate for solving the root cause, which is that regulation is increasing the cost to provide that care?
Part of the challenge that we face in childcare is, and we'll frequently have this argument at the Capitol where the Dems are arguing that there's not enough money in the system, and the Republicans argue that we have too much regulations. And the reality is they're both right and they're both wrong. There is a funding issue and there is a regulation issue. When you think about a typical market, when you try and increase revenues, you're looking at expanding your customer base. Well, the reality is we can't just put more kids into a single setting. We don't want 20 kids in a basement of a single family licensed provider. And so there are some of those constraints that we do have, but there are some regulations that we can look at freeing up. For instance, on this pod model, one of the issues we have in Greater Minnesota is the cost of that we have tied in with regulations on full centers, as far as sprinkler systems and so on and so forth. But we have a lot of spaces in Greater Minnesota that we can incorporate into some level of childcare. And so there's some things like that that we need to look at. But the reality is we need to be looking at both the cost and the regulation side of the equation. So now moving on to housing. I want to highlight, all of you know what the housing crunch is in Greater Minnesota, but I do want to highlight just a couple of things from our friends at the Center for Rural Policy and Development have brought forward in the past couple of years that to me really highlights what the childcare or what the housing crisis is in Greater Minnesota. So this first slide here kind of shows for a typical worker and labor force in our communities, what they can afford for their housing allotment. And then the second part of this shows when we have a new home in our communities, what it gets appraised for. And then the third part talks about what that actual construction cost comes into. And so when you think about the split between what the worker can afford and what the construction costs are, and then throw in the reality that the construction costs are more than what the house is going to be appraised for, you have market failure that just isn't allowing new development to happen in our communities. And so somehow we need to address this equilibrium point so that we can bring the market back in alignment so we can get some of these developments happening. We see a similar thing happening in the rental market where the median rent in our rural areas is well below what a developer needs from rent to finance projects. So again, we need to figure out how do we bring these two things more into alignment. And then the third area is we have a lot of great housing stock in our communities, but a lot of it is just outdated and needs some work done on it. But the challenge we run into, again, with the marketplace is when we do these renovations in these homes, the appraised value is still below in a lot of situations what the cost of a substandard home and the renovations comes into play. And so all the things we need to be looking at is how do we bring the housing market back into alignment in Greater Minnesota? And so a few things we're looking at, 2 new programs and then an expansion of an existing program. So one new program that we're looking at is what we're calling the Fix Up Fund, which would be a $5 million grant program for cities to rehab dilapidated housing. Can we take some of our older housing, do some new roof work, do some new HVAC, do new windows or whatever, and turn some of that 1940s, 1950s housing that may not have been updated at all since the 1970s and bring it up to a 2020 house, or I guess now it's 2021 house, so that it's fitting the needs that our workers have today. The second program we're looking at is the Greater Minnesota Housing Public Infrastructure Program. For those of you that have heard me talk about this, this looks a lot like our BDPI program, but focusing on housing, where we can get some state grants to help offset the public infrastructure that needs to happen to expand our housing capacity in our communities. One of the things that happens all too often is we have these infrastructure costs that get passed on to developers who then get passed on to consumers. If we can take that cost out of the equation, then we start to shift that cost structure, and we might be able to bring things back into a better equilibrium point. And then the third one is the Greater Minnesota Workforce Housing Development Fund, which is an existing program that we'd like to see increase from $4 million a biennium to $6 million a biennium. But more importantly, we want to see the grant allowance increase from 25% to 50%. This is in concept a great program in Greater Minnesota, but doesn't work as well as it should, because a lot of times once the public financing comes into the equation, the cost of that project increases to the point where the additional cost out is greater than what the grant is for. A lot of that has to do with the incorporation of prevailing wage into these projects. And we believe if we can increase that grant allowance from 25% to 50%, the grant will then pay for what we need for the development and the additional costs that come in from the state requirements, again, making that program more beneficial for our communities. And then by adding $2 million more into the program, we'll see a greater impact across Greater Minnesota. So then the third area we're looking at is the Business Development Public Infrastructure Program. Again, this is a program that provides grants for up to 50% of the capital costs for infrastructure to expand economic growth, retain, create jobs, increase tax base, primarily around industrial sites in Greater Minnesota communities. Since 2010, this has been an extremely successful program. We've had more than $70 million awarded to our communities, 140 different projects. We've had 5,000 jobs created and 9,500 jobs retained. Indeed, will frequently say that this is one of the most successful programs they have. But what we want to see is that this program be fully funded for the biennium. There was money included in the bonding bill from this fall, but it wasn't enough for what we know the demand is going to be for this program. So the first thing that we need to see is a bonding bill pass this session and include $20 million in new funding for BDPI. In addition, we want to see the state maintain the general fund appropriation. A couple of years ago, the legislature added $3.5 million per biennium into this program out of the state's general fund. We want to see that continue. Unfortunately, in the governor's budget announcement that came out yesterday, he did reduce funding for this a little bit. We aren't happy about that. We think that $3.5 million needs to stay there. And so that's one of the things we'll be working with the jobs committees as the legislature puts their budget proposals together. So as Bradley indicated, we do have these advocacy weeks coming up. We have childcare coming up in 2 weeks, the week of February 8th. We do have a webinar. There is a date change on that. It was scheduled for Monday. It's now Tuesday from 11 to 11:45. That's due to a scheduling conflict we had with our folks from First Children's Finance. Suzanne Pearl and the folks at First Children's Finance are doing a ton of work in our communities on the childcare crisis. And so this will be a great resource for all of you that want to dig deeper into this issue. And then the week of February 22nd, we'll have our housing advocacy week. We'll have a webinar on that Monday where I'll do a deeper dive into the 3 bills that we're working on and have a deeper conversation with that. You can get more information on our website. So please take time to look at that and register for those events. If you have any questions about these issues or about the advocacy weeks, feel free to reach out to either myself or Shane Zart.
We have one question on housing. Has there been any discussion about reforming the small cities grant program for housing rehab, especially pertaining to target areas, or give cities more flexibility outside the target areas?
There has been some work on that, and it's something that I know on the Senate side that they are interested in looking into that one a little bit more, and so we will be working on that some this session. So at this point, I'll turn things back over to Bradley for final comments for this morning.
Thank you, Scott. And final comments, but of our first session here, but by no means the end of our time together, as we've got our great legislative panel coming up. So to kind of bring it all together and kind of really sort of distill everything that we've talked about this morning into some sort of brief messaging for folks. Our message for legislators, first and foremost, if there's any COVID-19 relief, it must be distributed in an equitable manner across the state. Again, we were able, I think, to accomplish that during the discussion of the CARES Act funding, and that's going to be our goal here going forward as well. Local government aid is critical to supporting our cities, both during the pandemic, through the end of it, and then as we go into recovery. It must be paid on time and in full. As Liz mentioned, despite the fact that we had a pretty good bonding bill last year, the needs continue. We should be looking at a bonding bill this year of, modest, focused on core infrastructure, like the clean water infrastructure programs. $100 million is what we think we need there to continue to move the ball forward. And then finally, childcare and housing were really important issues across greater Minnesota before the pandemic. They remain critical now. And so we need to continue to make the investments and then also find solutions that are really focused on greater Minnesota's unique challenges as it relates to those two issues. So lobbying in the time of COVID, you see a little cartoon there. Turns out the culprit was your host here, Zoom. So those of you who grew up in the 80s certainly recognize that cartoon there, and Scooby-Doo, where are you? All right, so lobbying in the time of COVID. So I know many of you have set up meetings already to meet with your legislators about CGMC priorities. If you've not, we'd certainly encourage you to do so. We can help arm you with more information if you need. Use the packet of information that got emailed out several times now over the last couple of days. Legislators are using Zoom. They are available by email, text, calling. We're finding, I think, that in most cases, legislators actually are pretty accessible and that they really are trying to make themselves accessible, and they realize that things are difficult. And so, take advantage of all of these platforms. One of the things that I want to mention that we've encountered just here in our own office is that, some legislators may want to meet with you in person. If you feel safe doing so, you certainly can and you should. But I also think that it is perfectly fine to indicate that if you don't feel safe, that you would prefer to do a call or a virtual meeting. You should not be shy at all about that if you just don't feel comfortable meeting in person with your legislator. Take advantage of CGMC opportunities to do our virtual meetings with legislators. Like I said, I think we're going to try to incorporate more of those through the course of the year because we have this great tool of Zoom to be able to pull together people from across the state, kind of in real time together. Respond to CGMC action alerts. I think that's going to be one of the things that we'll probably rely on, maybe even more so than we have in past years. And that's because, when we're wandering around the Capitol, we can grab a legislator and say, hey, this is kind of an issue, this is going on, this might be going on in committee, we need you to pay attention to it. Because the Capitol is closed, locked, behind a fence, we don't have those kind of opportunities. And so we are going to be relying on much more external communication coming in, both from us, but then I think also from our members as well. And then, if you are trying to get a hold of your legislators for whatever reason, whether it's, CGMC stuff, or if it is just stuff that you're working on for your own city, and you're having problems getting a hold of them, or they're not responsive, let us know. We might be able to help. We might be able to help connect you with your legislator if you're having problems, and we're happy to do so for whatever reason, CGMC related or not. And then finally, I do think that in the world that we live in, things like Twitter and Facebook and social media obviously are elevated in importance in terms of communications and getting messages across and being in touch with folks. And it's a great tool to amplify our message if not only are you following what CGMC is doing, but that you are reposting, tagging your legislators, being engaged in that social media virtual kind of way. Those are the things that I think really are what we need in terms of getting everything forward. We've got a couple of minutes here to take any questions if there are any. If you do have questions going forward, you've got Liz's contact information, you've got Scott's contact information. This is mine. Please don't hesitate to email or call. I would say emailing and using my cell phone are the best ways to get a hold of me personally. So with that, it does not appear that we have any questions. So do come back at 10:30. We've got a panel of legislative leaders. We've got minority leaders, Kent and Doubt, Senate and House respectively. And then from the majority parties, we've got Assistant Majority Leader John Jasinski from the Senate Republicans and Assistant Majority Leader Dan Wolgamott from the House Democrats. So definitely stay tuned for that. It'll be a lively discussion for sure.